Hey, this is Miss Cooper. I'm going to do another review of your review sheet. I'm going to just do 8 chapters. You make sure that you have all of your notes from every chapter. Things that you don't have, you need to send me an email, let me know what you don't have so that I can get that for you. So chapter 1 talked about the beginning of the African chattel slavery and how Africans were brought over here from Africa. We were given labels, we were given all types of names. There were certain cities that had larger populations. And go back to your notes for chapter 1 to get that information. Esteban was an explorer, a black explorer. Timbuktu was a learning center. People had come from all over the world to go to Timbuktu to learn. So yeah, chapter 2 deals with the American Revolution. So if you're going to write an essay on anything pertaining to the American Revolution, go back to chapter 2. Crispus Attucks was the first African American who is killed and actually the first person who was killed in the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre includes the death of Crispus Attucks, but is an attack on unarmed civilians at a pub, a bar. Okay, British soldiers shot these people who didn't have guns, and they called it a massacre. And yeah, we're still upset about people who shoot people who don't have guns. So think about that. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution starts in about 1776 and ends with the American Constitution in about 1791, around in there. Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey were both black men who started rebellions. Neither of those rebellions were successful. Everybody gets killed, but it sparked the idea that black people do not want to continue to be enslaved. In chapter 3, we talk about the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopalian. That's what AME stands for. The abolitionists, Frederick Douglass was a major voice in the abolitionist movement. This is what you would call the beginning of the civil rights movement. It's definitely where it starts, with ending slavery. And the civil rights movement doesn't really end until Martin Luther King and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So from 1865 to 1965, we had 100 years of trying to get equality for African Americans. The Dred Scott case did not help the abolitionist movement because they were trying to take rights away from people who might have gone to free states. They said, we're going to yank you back to a slave state. The raid on Harper's Ferry is another example of the fed upness of African Americans and saying, hey, we're not going to do this peacefully. So yeah, they go into violence. And then there's a period at the end of the American Civil War. We go into the period called Reconstruction, and it's a total failure. So go to chapter 3 and look at those notes and get information about that. Chapter 4 talks more about Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. All three of those black men were leaders and orators, which means they were speakers. They wrote fabulous books. Booker T's book was Up From Slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois' book was The Souls of Black Folks. Chapter 5 dealt with Marcus Garvey, the Harlem Renaissance, World War I, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. Marcus Garvey was an advocate for Pan-Africanism, which says you need to move back to Africa if you want to get yourself, established. But he went to jail for mail fraud because he planned to take some people back to Africa, and it seemed like he ripped these people off, so it didn't happen. Chapter 6 deals with African Americans trying to get involved in politics, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, this organization called the CIO. Then there's World War II that gets talked about in chapter 6. The civil rights movement is continuing because black soldiers are going to war and in some cases being drafted, but not being treated fairly back in America. Then there's Brown versus the Board of Education. So this is going to eliminate Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the separate but equal doctrine in 1896. So we get to Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education in 1954. So very, very landmark. That's very much that's a landmark piece of legislation right there. The SCLC stands for Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That's established by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To note, back in chapter 4, W.E.B. Du Bois is the founder or the organizer of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. And in chapter 7, it reiterates the NAACP, the SCLC, the SNCC, which we call SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and core Congress on racial equality. They're the ideas of Malcolm X. They're the ideas of the Black Panthers. Langston Hughes was a Harlem Renaissance poet who kind of coined the phrase Black is beautiful. Chapter 8 talks about Lyndon Johnson's piece of domestic policy that he called the Great Society, the beating of Rodney King, and the election of Condoleezza Rice, the first Black woman who was in the cabinet, if I'm not mistaken, but definitely Secretary of State. Condoleezza Rice was the first Black woman to be Secretary of State. So we'll do 9 through 16 on tomorrow. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Make sure you review all your notes. Just write 5 facts, put them in the chat box, send them to me in an email, and continue to review. Thank you for being here.